There is a meeting happening right now that Washington has no seat at. Not because it was excluded, because it chose to leave. The European Union and Canada are constructing a joint defense procurement framework, one that allows Canadian companies to bid on $244 billion in European military contracts, and the United States is not part of it. Not because of anti-American sentiment in Brussels, because of a series of specific decisions made in Washington that made American partnership too expensive and too unreliable to depend on. That is the sentence every American should sit with. Not too hostile, not too weak, too expensive, and too unreliable. This is the story of how the United States spent 80 years building the most powerful alliance system in human history, and then began systematically dismantling it. Not through military defeat, not through economic collapse, but through a sequence of choices that told allies, clearly and repeatedly, that Washington valued short-term leverage over long-term partnership. And this is the story of what those allies are doing about it. Part 1. Liberation Day and what it actually liberated. April 2nd, 2025. The White House called it Liberation Day, an executive order imposing sweeping tariffs on imports from virtually every country on Earth, allies, adversaries, neutral nations, everyone. The European Union was hit with 20% across the board. Countries that had signed free trade agreements with the U.S., countries that had sent troops to fight alongside American soldiers in Afghanistan and Iraq, countries that had supported American sanctions against Russia, China, and Iran. All of them woke up that morning to find themselves treated the same as adversaries. Let's be honest about what the trade deficit argument that justified this actually measures. The U.S. trade deficit in goods with the EU is real, roughly 157 billion euros. But when you include services, American financial services, insurance, consulting, and software that Europeans buy, the relationship is much closer to balance. The EU's own figures show the actual imbalance shrinks to around 50 billion euros when services are included. The administration used the larger goods-only number because it made the political case for tariffs easier. That is not economic policy. That is politics wearing economics as a costume, and Europe knew it. The EU's response was not panic, it was preparation. European officials had been wargaming Trump's return to the presidency for over a year before January 2025. They had prepared lists of American exports that could face retaliatory tariffs, chosen carefully to maximize political pain in swing states where those products were made. Bourbon from Kentucky, Harley-Davidsons from Wisconsin, soybeans from Iowa. The EU's anti-coercion legislation, passed in 2023, had been designed specifically for this moment. Europe had the tools. What it debated fiercely was whether to use them. Part 2. The deal that satisfied nobody. The Turnberry Agreement of July 27, 2025, represents what happens when a weaker party negotiates under duress. The EU accepted a 15% tariff ceiling on its exports, better than the threatened 30%, but a permanent new cost that didn't exist before 2025. In exchange, Europe agreed to terms that analysts across the political spectrum called one-sided. Zero tariffs on American industrial goods, $600 billion in promised American investment, which the EU Commission had no authority to guarantee, $750 billion in energy purchases, requiring infrastructure that doesn't exist, and acceptance of American car safety standards. European officials signed it because the alternative, a full trade war at a moment when Europe was already funding Ukraine's defense and managing an energy transition away from Russian gas, was genuinely worse. But they signed it without trust. And that distinction matters enormously. A deal signed under duress by a partner who doesn't trust you is a deal that will be abandoned at the first viable opportunity. The first viable opportunity arrived quickly. Within weeks of signing, The U.S. reclassified hundreds of steel and aluminum derivative products and raised their tariffs to 50%. No consultation, no warning, no attempt to square the action with the agreement just signed. Europe's response was methodical. Bernd Lange, the EU's chief trade lawmaker, publicly declared the deal breached. The European Parliament suspended its ratification vote. France began formally pushing for activation of the anti-coercion instrument. Let's translate what the ACI means in practical terms. If triggered, the EU can bar American companies from participating in EU government contracts, one of the largest procurement markets in the world. It can restrict American investment into the EU. It can impose targeted tariffs designed to hit specific American industries and specific American congressional districts. This is not a blunt instrument. It is a surgical one, designed by Brussels officials who have spent years studying the American political map and know exactly which sectors and which states hurt most. Part 3. The Man with the Blueprint. While the tariff drama was unfolding across the Atlantic, Mark Carney was executing a strategy that Washington hadn't properly noticed. Carney is a rare figure in modern politics, a former central banker who understands both the mechanics of global finance and the language of democratic leadership. As governor of the Bank of Canada and then the Bank of England, he navigated the 2008 financial crisis and the Brexit uncertainty, both moments that required him to communicate complex systemic risk to non-specialist audiences. He knows how systems break. He knows what the warning signs look like. And when he called Trump's trade agenda a rupture rather than a transition at Davos in January 2025, he was doing something very specific. He was giving permission to allies who were thinking the same thing but couldn't say it yet. His first diplomatic calls as Prime Minister were to Paris and London. His government's first overseas travel was to France, the UK, and Nunavut, the Arctic territory whose sovereignty Trump had threatened by proxy through his Greenland ambitions. The symbolism was deliberate. Canada is not pivoting away from America, but it is building a world in which Canada's security and prosperity do not require American permission. The June 2025 Canada-EU Summit produced the Security and Defense Partnership, a framework for integrating Canadian and European defense procurement, sharing intelligence across cyber and space domains, and coordinating on critical raw materials and industrial policy. In December 2025, Canada concluded negotiations to participate in SAFE, unlocking $244 billion in European defense procurement for Canadian manufacturers. Canadian companies can now build what European armies need: ammunition, drones, missiles, communications systems. That is industrial policy and foreign policy and defense policy wrapped into a single strategic move. What makes this remarkable is not the size of the deal. It is the speed. Carney became Prime Minister in March 2025. By December, Canada had concluded SAFE participation negotiations. 9 months. In diplomatic terms, that is fast. It suggests that the groundwork for this partnership had been laid before Carney formally took office, that the relationships, the framework conversations, the technical working groups were already in motion, which means that people on both sides of the Atlantic had been preparing for a world in which American partnership was unreliable, long before the public conversation caught up. Part 4. What Europe is actually building. Here is the picture that emerges when you look at Europe's moves across 2025 and into 2026. On defense, European NATO members have agreed to push spending toward 5% of GDP by 2035. The EU's Readiness 2030 plan targets $1.3 trillion in European defense investment. The SAFE instrument is deploying $244 billion in loans for joint procurement. The Pentagon has told European allies it wants them to take over primary conventional defense responsibility by 2027. European governments are racing to build the capability to meet that deadline, not because they want to lose American support, but because they have been told, in writing, that American support may not be there if they don't. On trade, the EU-Canada CETA framework is being deepened into digital trade, critical raw materials, and industrial policy. EU trade negotiations with India, Mercosur, and African partners are accelerating. The internal EU single market is being strengthened in ways that reduce dependence on any single external partner. The European Semiconductor Initiative is building domestic chip manufacturing capacity to reduce reliance on American and Asian technology supply chains. On intelligence, the Canada-EU Security and Defense Partnership explicitly covers cyber and space. Canada's intelligence community, part of the Five Eyes network, is deepening its direct cooperation with European partners. This does not remove the United States from intelligence sharing, but it creates redundancy. A world with multiple intelligence sharing nodes is a world where the United States has less leverage over each individual node. The U.S. National Security Strategy, published in December 2025, explicitly called for cultivating resistance to Europe's current trajectory within European nations. Washington is now openly backing political forces in Europe aligned with the Kremlin's preference for a fragmented continent. The Kremlin's own response to the American NSS was, according to multiple analysts, that it was largely consistent with Russian strategic preferences. America's allies noticed. Their response is what we are watching. Part 5. The question nobody in Washington is asking. Here is the thing about leverage. When you use it against friends repeatedly, they stop being friends. They become counterparties. And counterparties optimize against you. The Transatlantic Alliance was not built on sentimentality. It was built on the recognition that democratic nations with shared values, shared threats, and interdependent economies are stronger together than apart. That recognition produced 80 years of peace in Western Europe after centuries of catastrophic warfare. It produced the most powerful military alliance in human history. It produced the largest bilateral trade and investment relationship in the world. And it produced a rules-based international order that, whatever its imperfections, created the conditions for the greatest expansion of human prosperity in recorded history. All of that was built on trust. Not blind trust, not unconditional trust, but the reasonable expectation that agreements would be honored, that consultation would precede unilateral action, that partnership would be treated as something more than a protection racket. That expectation is now broken. Not irreparably. But the repair requires a different approach than the one Washington is currently demonstrating. Europe is not abandoning America. European leaders, from von der Leyen to Starmer to Macron to Friedrich Merz, have made clear they want a functional transatlantic relationship. But they are done making that relationship the only relationship. They are building alternatives, not because they hate Washington, because they have learned the hard way that a single point of dependency is a vulnerability. The uncomfortable question for American strategic thinkers is this: what is the end state that Washington is building toward? A world where European allies have no alternative but American partnership is a world where American leverage is maximum. But it is also a world where European resentment is maximum, where European political will to maintain the alliance is fragile, and where any disruption can shatter the whole thing. That is not stability. That is a coercive relationship with a ticking clock. The alternative, allies who choose to partner with America because partnership is genuinely beneficial, who have options but consistently prefer the American option because it is better, is more stable, more durable, and ultimately more powerful. Because willing partners fight harder, share more intelligence, and contribute more resources than reluctant dependents. That is the strategic lesson that the current moment is teaching, whether Washington is paying attention or not. And the countries that are learning it, Canada, The EU member states, the UK, Australia, are acting on it. The architecture they are building will outlast any single administration. The question is whether America will be part of it, or whether it will watch from outside a structure it once led. That answer is being decided right now, in Brussels, in Ottawa, in trade negotiating rooms and defense procurement offices and central bank strategy sessions that most Americans will never hear about. Until the consequences show up in their paycheck, their savings, and their security. And by then, the architecture will already be finished. If this framing gave you something the mainstream conversation isn't giving you, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. This story doesn't pause. Drop a comment below with where you stand. Is Europe's strategic pivot a rational response to American unreliability, or a mistake that weakens the entire democratic world?